Forgiveness. In a word, that is what today's gospel reading is about, of course. One writer imagines the exchange between Peter and Jesus like this. So, Jesus, just how many times should I forgive? Like 7? But Jesus thumbs up. Nope. More than that, my friend. So like 17. Jesus says, not even close. Keep going. Peter says, you're kidding, right? And Jesus says, try 77 times. And Peter says, that's ridiculous. Impossible. Feels ridiculous, doesn't it? Forgive 77 times, he tells us. And we know that number doesn't mean 77, it means forever, right? Always keep forgiving. We try to put a number on forgiveness, set contractual arrangements for it to take, establish parameters for when or when not to forgive. But Jesus is telling us in this moment, forgiveness doesn't work like that. Jesus then goes on to tell a parable meant to help us think deeply about the nature of forgiveness. Now, I think to understand this parable, it's worth taking a moment to consider the relative value of the debts being discussed. In the first instance, the man who was the king's slave owed him 10,000 talents. So what does that mean, right? What's a talent? A talent is actually a measure of weight. It would be about 130 pounds. And it was typically used in reference to silver or gold. A talent of silver would then be worth about 15 years of wages for the average worker. A single talent would be worth about 15 years of wages for the average worker. So 10,000 talents would be worth 150,000 years of wages. Now let's keep going, right? In Wheaton, the average household income was more than $80,000. So if you do all the math, right, the sum of the debt owed by the servant in today's dollars in the Wheaton area would be around $12 billion. Sounds absurd, right? He owed his master $12 billion. Give or take a few million, of course. On the other hand, the second slave owed the first 100 denarii, right? And a denarii was about, a day's worth of wages. So, using the same numbers to create a conversion, we'd be talking about a debt of around $22,000. So it's not insignificant, but it's not the same kind of absurd, life-shattering amount as $12 billion. Perhaps the point of this parable then in part lies in the contrast between the extravagant act of forgiveness offered by the king and the servant's choice not to reciprocate this act for what is comparatively a paltry sum. The king forgave his servant a $12 billion debt, and the same servant couldn't find it in himself to forgive $22,000. One thing I think this parable suggests too is that forgiveness is reciprocal for Christians. We recognize that God has forgiven us first, and so then we're obligated to forgive others. In a sense, it's as if we're being commanded to make forgiveness an integral part of our life. And this idea is, of course, at the very heart of the gospel. Remember in the Lord's Prayer, one of the lines Jesus teaches us to pray is, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." This could also be translated, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who have debts against us." In the end, Peter's question doesn't really deny the essential need to forgive or its reciprocal nature, though. He seems to assume forgiveness is important. And he thinks offering forgiveness 7 times seems generous, right? He understands it's expected of him to forgive others. He just also seems to believe with his question that there must come a time when enough is enough. Truly forgiving someone's not always easy. So how can it keep going on forever, right? And therein lies the mystery of God's grace. For us, forgiveness is hard enough to make sense of when we think about just the day-to-day slights. The person who's rude to us, the person who consistently speaks over us, the person who cuts us off when we're driving, that person who betrays a minor confidence. and on and on. In the heat of the moment, our first response isn't to forgive. It's to say a few choice words, or at least think them. But typically, we quickly move on because these interactions are fairly insignificant, and the forgiveness itself is in a way implicit. But then there are the bigger things of life. The all too real experiences of war, torture, murder, and abuse. And these are things Jesus is talking about too. Just this Thursday, we had a conversation about the Vietnam era and the war that defined it. This conversation was a reminder that these types of experiences, they aren't a world away. They're experiences shared by members of our very community. And then there's, of course, the violence in Chicago, just a few miles away, really, which has repeatedly made the national news. Certain neighborhoods might rightly be called war zones in their own right. How does forgiveness fit in there? Then there's the blight of domestic violence and abuse, which happens in every community, in homes we would least expect. And we could list many more heartbreaking realities that people in these pews and in our communities and all around the world have to face. Yeah, the need for forgiveness is pervasive and real, and not something to diminish or make light of. Now, I've never personally had to face the difficult task of surviving such extreme circumstances. And I'm not going to pretend to understand what it's like to forgive another after having survived such things either. Yet I feel compelled to acknowledge these realities are part of the world because I think Jesus' words on forgiveness are meant to be about them too. The parable and the conversation between Jesus and Peter suggests that as impossible as it sounds, there is no limit on how many times we're called to forgive, and there's no limit on what we are called to forgive. Remember the size of that debt, $12 billion, which is forgiven. And Jesus calls us to forgive not 7 times, but 77 times, over and over and over and over again. And yet even then, if I'm being honest, I have to admit I struggle with the idea of ever telling someone, especially someone who's gone through an extreme life situation, that they must forgive another person. I think in the end, maybe that's God's thing to do. But see, that's where the parable invites us to see what God has already done for us. Maybe most of us can't make sense of how to be the Lord who forgives the impossibly large debt. But maybe we can make sense of what it means to be the servant whose debt is forgiven. And after all, isn't that where the parable starts? A Lord forgiving an impossibly large debt of a servant who asks for it. One author writes, I can identify with the servant with the massive debt who has been forgiven so much, which means that my first job isn't to assume or insist that I must forgive incalculable debts, but simply to bask in the unbelievable forgiveness, acceptance, and grace that I have experienced, and try as much as I can to live out of that. The failure of the first servant isn't simply that he won't forgive his comrade, but that he has just experienced an utterly unexpected, completely beyond his wildest dreams, life-changing moment of grace, and seems absolutely untouched by it. And for this reason, he lives devoid of any sense of gratitude. His whole life changed, and he didn't even notice. If we hope to be a people capable of the kind of forgiveness Jesus invites us into, we must first notice. We must notice we have already been forgiven and redeemed. That is the good news after all. Nothing we can do can separate us from the love of God. That is the promise of this parable. All will be and can be forgiven. In the end, perhaps the act of forgiveness isn't primarily then about the other person at all. It's really first and foremost about us. Rabbi Harold Kushner tells a story. A woman in my congregation comes to see me. She's a single mother, divorced, working to support herself and 3 young children. She says to me, since my husband walked out on us, every month is a struggle to pay our bills. I have to tell my kids we have no money to go to the movies, while he's living it up with his new wife in another state. How can you tell me to forgive him? I answer her, I'm not asking you to forgive him because what he did was acceptable. It wasn't. It was mean and selfish. I'm asking you to forgive because he doesn't deserve the power to live in your head and turn you into a bitter, angry person. I'd like to see him out of your life emotionally as completely as he is out of it physically. But you keep holding on to him. You're not hurting him by holding on to that resentment, but you're hurting yourself. Maybe a part of the need to forgive is that when we forgive another, it makes us more whole somehow. Forgiveness heals us and has the potential to heal our relationships by enabling us to let go of that hurt. When we forgive, we refuse the right to hold on to bitterness and anger. When we forgive, we refuse to let the past define the future. Now, I'm not naive enough to think this is easy. It isn't. I'm also not saying that if you find forgiveness difficult, there's something wrong with you. That isn't true. What I am saying is that in this conversation about forgiveness, Jesus has given us something incredible to aspire to. He's offered us a vision of the world radically different from what we're used to. And when we make the choice to forgive, as he asks, we make the choice to make the kingdom of God more real. Bishop Desmond Tutu, a man who lived through apartheid and is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and who, if anyone has the right to talk about forgiveness, does, writes this about it. He says, forgiveness helps us to recognize that good and evil are real and that they matter. And when we forgive another, we proclaim that despite all the evidence that seems to the contrary, there is no way that evil and injustice and oppression and lies can have the last word. In those moments when I find myself wondering if what Jesus asks of us is really possible, I am grateful for the witness of people like Desmond Tutu, people of faith who've already made the choice to forgive, even when those who take what is dearest to them. People of faith who show us that Jesus' words are indeed possible to embody. There is Nadine Collier, whose grandmother was killed in a shooting at an AME church in 2015. At the first hearing for the murder, she told Dylan Roof, I forgive you. You took something precious from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never ever hold her again, but I forgive you and have mercy on your soul. Hard to imagine that kind of forgiveness. Or in 2009, after a shooting at an Amish school, there's the story of Amish neighbors of the shooter visiting his family to comfort them in their sorrow and pain. Or there's the witness of Sheila Cassidy, an English doctor tortured by the Pinochet regime in Chile. She once wrote, I would never say to someone, you must forgive. I would dare not. Who am I to tell a woman whose father abused her or a mother whose daughter has been raped that she must forgive? I can only say, however much we've been wrong, however justified our hatred, if we cherish it, it will poison us. We must pray for the power to forgive, for it's in forgiving that we are healed. This forgiveness stuff is powerful and profound. It's at the heart of the gospel and who God is calling us to be. It's not easy, yes. But nonetheless, how the light of Christ breaks into the world in places we least expect at times. How we refuse to allow hatred to win and say there will be another way through love. May we leave today first and foremost assured of God's love for us, because it all begins there. May we never forget that God has already forgiven us our debts. May we then have the strength and courage to truly be a people able to live as Jesus invites us to. Amen.